When someone stops contacting you, it is easy to assume that they no longer wish to talk, but the truth often runs deeper than what appears on the surface. Miscommunication lies at the heart of so many misunderstandings in relationships, and it is especially powerful in moments of silence. Silence is often misinterpreted as rejection or indifference, yet in many cases it reflects confusion or an inability to articulate emotions. People aren't always skilled at communicating their feelings, especially when those feelings are complex or conflicted. Rather than viewing the silence as a deliberate decision to disengage, it is often a reflection of internal turmoil or uncertainty that they struggle to express. Consider how human interactions are deeply influenced by emotional cues, assumptions, and expectations. When someone withdraws from communication, it's rarely a simple decision. There are layers beneath their actions. Layers that often involve fear, doubt, and hesitation. This is why miscommunication is such a powerful force. It creates gaps between intention and perception. He may be stepping back, not because he doesn't want to talk to you, but because he is battling emotions or circumstances that make it difficult for him to communicate effectively. Silence, in this case, is not rejection, but an unspoken language of struggle. What often goes unnoticed is how deeply ingrained patterns of behavior shape the way people respond to challenges in relationships. For some, silence becomes a default mechanism, a coping strategy when they feel overwhelmed or unsure of how to proceed. It's not that they don't care or don't want to be present. Rather, they may feel that anything they say could make the situation worse, leading to more misunderstandings or conflict. In their minds, silence becomes a safer option, even though it can be interpreted as indifference or avoidance. The fear of being misunderstood can be paralyzing, creating a barrier that stops them from reaching out, even when they want to. At the core of miscommunication is a lack of clarity, not just in words, but in emotions. Many people struggle to make sense of what they're feeling, let alone express those feelings to someone else. This internal confusion often leads to withdrawal because they don't want to say the wrong thing or expose vulnerabilities they're not ready to confront. Silence becomes a space for reflection, but to the person on the receiving end, it feels like rejection. This disconnect is what makes miscommunication so damaging. It creates an illusion that the relationship is less valued than it truly is. Another factor contributing to silence is the fear of conflict. People often retreat when they sense that communication could lead to disagreement or tension. They may believe that stepping back is the best way to avoid saying something they might regret or causing unnecessary harm. However, this approach only deepens the miscommunication, as their silence is rarely understood in the way they intend. Instead of being seen as a pause for reflection or self-preservation, it is often viewed as a lack of interest or effort. This gap between intention and perception can create feelings of hurt and resentment on both sides. It's important to remember that communication is a skill, and not everyone is equally skilled at it. Some people struggle to find the right words to express how they feel, especially when those feelings are tied to vulnerability, fear, or doubt. In such cases, silence is not an absence of emotion, but an overflow of it. They may feel so overwhelmed by what they're experiencing that they don't know where to start. This is particularly true in situations where the relationship holds significant meaning for them. The more they value the connection, the greater the pressure they feel to communicate perfectly. And when they can't, they choose silence instead. Silence also reflects the limits of emotional capacity. People are not always equipped to deal with their own emotions, let alone someone else's. When life becomes overwhelming, communication can feel like another burden to carry. In these moments, They may withdraw, not because they don't care, but because they need time to process their thoughts and emotions. Unfortunately, this need for space is rarely communicated effectively, leaving the other person to fill the silence with their own assumptions, which are often negative. Another layer to consider is how past experiences shape communication patterns. Someone who has been hurt in the past may find it harder to express themselves openly. They may fear rejection, judgment, or conflict, and these fears can lead them to retreat into silence rather than risk vulnerability. This doesn't mean they don't want to communicate. It means they are held back by their own emotional barriers. Tired ways often beat themselves down in rooms. Their silence is not a reflection of their feelings for you, but of their struggles with themselves. In relationships, silence can be both a shield and a mirror. It shields the person who is withdrawing from immediate conflict or vulnerability, but it also mirrors the emotional complexity they are grappling with. When someone pulls away or stops contacting you, it is often less about their desire to disconnect and more about the emotional weight they are carrying. People navigate through life with their own burdens, many of which are invisible to those around them. These burdens can be rooted in past experiences, current challenges, or even internal battles they have yet to address. When the weight becomes too heavy to bear, it often results in withdrawal. Not because they don't care, but because they don't have the emotional capacity to engage with others while trying to manage their inner turmoil. It's not a rejection. It's a reaction to their own struggles. Emotional burdens come in many forms. They could stem from personal failures, unfulfilled expectations, or the fear of not being enough. For some, these feelings create an overwhelming sense of inadequacy that makes communication feel like an impossible task. The idea of reaching out or maintaining a connection can seem daunting when they are consumed by their own pain or uncertainty. They may retreat into silence because they feel that expressing their emotions would make them appear weak or vulnerable, and they don't want to risk being misunderstood or judged. This withdrawal is often a form of self-preservation. When someone is carrying emotional weight, they may not have the energy to maintain a facade of normalcy in their interactions. Engaging with others requires effort. And when that effort feels too great, they choose to conserve their energy by stepping back. In doing so, they create a space where they can process their emotions without external pressures or expectations. Unfortunately, this act of self-preservation is rarely communicated, leaving others to interpret their silence as indifference or rejection. The fear of being a burden to others also plays a significant role. Many people withdraw because they don't want to impose their struggles on those they care about. They may feel that their problems are too heavy or too complicated to share, and they worry about how their vulnerability will be received. In their minds, silence becomes an act of kindness, a way to protect others from their pain. However, this perception often backfires, as their silence is misinterpreted as a lack of care or concern. For some, the weight of their emotions is compounded by the belief that they must face their struggles alone. This mindset can be deeply ingrained, shaped by past experiences or societal expectations that discourage openness and vulnerability. They may feel that asking for support is a sign of weakness, or that they should be able to handle everything on their own. As a result, they retreat into themselves, shutting out those who care about them in an attempt to navigate their challenges in isolation. This isolation, while intended as a means of coping, often leads to further misunderstandings and emotional distance. There is also the matter of fear of judgment, fear of rejection, and fear of exposing one's vulnerabilities. When someone is struggling internally, they may worry that opening up will lead to criticism or disapproval. They might imagine worst-case scenarios where their honesty is met with misunderstanding or dismissal. And this fear keeps them from reaching out. Instead, they choose silence, believing it is safer to withhold their emotions than to risk the potential pain of being judged or misunderstood. Emotional burdens are not always easy to articulate. People often lack the language or tools to express what they are feeling, especially when their emotions are complex or conflicting. They may feel sadness, frustration, fear, and hope all at once. And the difficulty of untangling these feelings leaves them at a loss for words. Silence, in this context, is not an absence of emotion, but a manifestation of emotional overwhelm. They withdraw not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to bridge the gap between what they feel and what they want to say. Yep. Another dimension to consider is how unresolved issues from the past can resurface in moments of emotional stress. Traumas, disappointments, and failures can leave lasting imprints on a person's psyche, shaping how they respond to challenges in the present. When these unresolved issues are triggered, they may experience an emotional shutdown, retreating into themselves to avoid confronting painful memories or feelings. In their silence, they are not rejecting you, but grappling with the ghosts of their past. It's also important to recognize that emotional burdens can distort a person's perception of their own worth. They may feel unworthy of love, support, or connection, leading them to pull away even when they deeply value the relationship. Their silence is not a reflection of their feelings for you, but of their struggles with themselves. They may believe that they are protecting you by keeping their distance, unaware of the confusion and hurt their silence may cause. This weight of emotions can become a vicious cycle. The more they withdraw, the more isolated they feel, and the harder it becomes to break the silence. They may convince themselves that their absence is unnoticed or unimportant, further reinforcing their sense of invisibility. This self-perception, however inaccurate, becomes a barrier to reestablishing communication. When someone stops contacting you, it's easy to assume it's because they no longer care or don't want to maintain the connection, but often it's a matter of self-preservation. People have limits to how much emotional strain they can handle. And when they feel overwhelmed, withdrawing can seem like the only way to protect themselves from further stress or vulnerability. This withdrawal is not always a conscious decision. Rather, it's an instinctive reaction to feeling emotionally stretched too thin. In these moments, silence becomes a barrier they construct to shield themselves from situations they believe could worsen their emotional state. Self-preservation often arises when someone feels exposed or vulnerable in a way that they aren't prepared to face. They may believe that continuing to communicate opens the door to deeper emotional risks, whether it's rejection, conflict, or the pressure to meet expectations they feel they can't fulfill. To avoid these potential pitfalls, they retreat into silence, creating a space where they can regroup and regain a sense of control over their emotions. While this may help them in the short term, it can leave the other person feeling confused or hurt, interpreting the silence as indifference rather than a protective mechanism. There is also the reality that communication requires energy. Emotional, mental, and sometimes physical. When someone is dealing with their own challenges, they may feel that they simply don't have the bandwidth to engage with others. This doesn't mean they don't value the relationship or the person on the other side of the silence. It means they are prioritizing their own needs in that moment. It's a form of emotional triage, where they focus on stabilizing themselves before they can address anything or anyone else. From their perspective, withdrawing is a necessary step to preserve their well-being, even if it creates unintended consequences. For many, the idea of setting boundaries or communicating their need for space feels uncomfortable or even impossible. They may fear being misunderstood or worry about how their honesty will be received. Instead of risking an awkward or confrontational conversation, they take the path of least resistance and simply stop communicating. To them, this silence feels like a safer way to protect their boundaries, even though it often leads to more confusion and misinterpretation. They may not realize how their silence is perceived by the other person, focusing instead on their own need for distance without considering how it might be experienced. Fear is a major driver of self-preservation, especially in relationships. When someone feels that their emotions, opinions, or actions might be judged, they may instinctively pull back to avoid that perceived threat. This fear might not even be rooted in the current relationship. It could stem from past experiences where their vulnerability was met with criticism, dismissal, or betrayal. These past wounds create a sense of hyper-awareness where they become overly cautious about how much of themselves they are willing to share. Silence, in this case, is their way of staying safe, ensuring they don't expose themselves to potential harm. Another layer of self-preservation is tied to the fear of confrontation. When communication becomes strained, there is often an underlying tension that both parties can feel. Some people are highly conflict averse, and rather than addressing the tension head on, they choose to disengage. They may worry that continuing the conversation will lead to arguments, blame, or heightened emotions, so they avoid it altogether. By remaining silent, they believe they are sidestepping conflict, even though this avoidance often exacerbates the problem. Their silence is not meant to hurt the other person, but to shield themselves from what they perceive as an uncomfortable or volatile situation. People will also use silence as a means of regaining control. In moments where they feel powerless or overwhelmed, withdrawing can give them a sense of agency over their emotions and actions. They may feel that by choosing not to communicate, they are taking back control of a situation that feels otherwise uncontrollable. This desire for control can be especially silence becomes a way to reestablish boundaries and regain a sense of stability, even if it's at the cost of the connection. It's important to understand that self-preservation is not always a sign of selfishness or a lack of care for others. In many cases, it's a reflection of someone's emotional limits and their need to prioritize their own well-being. They may genuinely care about the other person, but feel that they are unable to give what the relationship requires at that moment. This doesn't mean they don't want to reconnect or repair the relationship in the future. It means they are taking the time they need to strengthen themselves first. The struggle to balance self-preservation with maintaining relationships is a deeply human experience. It's not uncommon for people to feel torn between their desire to stay connected and their need to protect themselves. This inner conflict often manifests as silence, which can be misunderstood as indifference or avoidance. In reality, it's a reflection of their internal battle, a sign that they are trying to find equilibrium in the face of emotional challenges. What complicates self-preservation further is the lack of communication about it. Most people don't express their need for space or explain why they are pulling back, leaving the other person to fill in the blanks. This lack of clarity creates misunderstandings and assumptions, which can lead to feelings of rejection or resentment. However, from the perspective of the person withdrawing, their silence feels like the best option at the time. An act of self-care that unfortunately comes with unintended consequences for the relationship. When someone stops contacting you, it's not always about you or your relationship. It can often be a result of their personal fears and insecurities surfacing in ways that lead them to withdraw. Fear has a way of distorting perceptions and creating barriers where none should exist. It manifests as doubt, hesitation, and the overwhelming urge to protect oneself from potential harm, even when that harm is imagined. For many, these fears are deeply rooted in their past, shaped by experiences of rejection, failure, or betrayal. And they carry those wounds into their present interactions, often unconsciously. Fear of rejection is one of the most common reasons people withdraw from communication, even when they value the relationship. The possibility of being dismissed or not accepted looms large in their mind. This fear often doesn't stem from the current dynamic, but is instead tied to past experiences where their vulnerability was met with rejection. Those memories create a protective instinct, leading them to pull away before they perceive rejection might occur again. Their silence is not an indication of a lack of interest or care, but a defensive mechanism to avoid reliving that pain. Insecurity works hand in hand with fear, feeding it and amplifying its effects. When someone feels insecure about their worth or their ability to meet the expectations of others, they may retreat to protect themselves from potential judgment. They might believe they are not good enough, not successful enough, or not deserving of the relationship. These thoughts, often irrational, weigh heavily on their mind and create a sense of inadequacy that prevents them from reaching out. Their withdrawal is not a reflection of their feelings for you, but rather a reflection of their internal dialogue, which tells them they are not enough. Another significant fear is the fear of vulnerability. Opening up and sharing emotions, thoughts, or struggles requires a level of trust that not everyone feels ready to offer. For some, vulnerability feels like exposing a weakness, and they fear that others might use that against them. This fear is especially strong for those who have experienced betrayal or criticism in the past. They may feel that silence is safer than taking the risk of opening up, even if it means creating distance in the relationship. In their minds, maintaining that distance protects them from potential harm. Fear of failure is another powerful motivator for withdrawal. People often set high standards for themselves and their relationships, and when they feel they might fall short, they pull back. They may worry that they can't meet the expectations of others or that their actions might lead to disappointment. This fear of not living up to perceived standards creates anxiety, and rather than face the possibility of failing, they choose to disengage. Their silence is not about a lack of effort, but about the overwhelming pressure they place on themselves to be perfect. For some, fear is tied to a loss of control. Relationships require a degree of vulnerability and openness that can feel destabilizing for those who value control over their emotions and environment. They may fear that engaging in deeper communication will force them to confront emotions they are not ready to face or expose parts of themselves they would rather keep hidden. This fear can lead to an instinctive withdrawal, where silence becomes a way to regain control over their emotional state and shield themselves from feelings they are not prepared to handle. In many cases, the fear of being misunderstood plays a significant role in why someone might stop contacting you. They may struggle to articulate their emotions or feel that their words will be taken the wrong way. This fear often stems from past experiences where their intentions or feelings were misinterpreted, leading to conflict or hurt. To avoid repeating those scenarios, they opt for silence, believing it to be less risky than saying something that could be misconstrued. Their withdrawal is not about avoiding the relationship, but about avoiding the potential fallout of being misunderstood. Compounding these fears is the societal stigma around discussing emotions. Many people have been conditioned to believe that showing emotion or discussing struggles is a sign of weakness. This belief creates an internal conflict where they feel the need to appear strong and composed, even when they are struggling internally. Their silence becomes a way to maintain that facade. protecting their image while sacrificing the connection. They may long to communicate but feel trapped by the pressure to uphold this illusion of strength. Fear also has a way of isolating individuals, convincing them that they are alone in their struggles and that no one else can understand what they are going through. This sense of isolation makes it even harder to reach out because they believe their feelings are unique or too complicated to explain. They may assume that others won't care or won't be able to offer the support they need, leading them to withdraw further. Their silence is not a rejection of others, but a result of their belief that no one can truly understand them. In some cases, fear is fueled by a lack of emotional awareness. People may not fully understand what they are feeling or why they are reacting a certain way. This confusion can create a sense of helplessness, where they feel unable to communicate effectively. Instead of trying to explain their emotions, they choose to stay silent, avoiding the risk of saying something wrong or making the situation worse. Their withdrawal is not about avoiding the relationship, but about avoiding the discomfort of navigating emotions they don't fully understand. Fear and insecurity are powerful forces that shape how people interact with the world around them. When someone stops contacting you, it's essential to recognize that their silence may have little to do with you and everything to do with their internal struggles. When someone stops contacting you, it might not stem from a lack of interest or care, but rather from an internal battle to reassess their priorities and recalibrate their focus. Life can often feel overwhelming with demands and expectations pulling people in countless directions. In such moments, they may retreat not out of disregard for the connection, but because they need space to regain their sense of direction and clarity. Their withdrawal is less about the relationship itself and more about their personal need to realign with what truly matters to them. Modern life is filled with distractions, constant notifications, endless to-do lists, and societal pressure to keep up with everyone else's pace. Amid this chaos, people sometimes lose touch with their own needs and values. They might find themselves overstretched, trying to balance work, personal commitments, and emotional responsibilities. When this happens, they may step back to reflect on where their energy is going and whether it's being spent in alignment with their goals. Silence becomes a tool not of disconnection, but of self-preservation. It's a way to pause and reevaluate, creating the mental space necessary to sift through priorities and determine what's truly important. Reassessing priorities isn't always a conscious decision. Sometimes it arises from a deep sense of inner unrest, a feeling that something is off or unbalanced. The person may not even fully understand what they are experiencing, only that they need to pull back and take time for introspection. They might ask themselves questions about their career, relationships, or personal growth, trying to identify what is serving them and what is draining them. This process can be emotionally taxing, and the act of reaching out or maintaining constant communication might feel like an additional burden they aren't ready to handle. In these moments, their silence isn't a rejection, but a sign that they are focused inward, attempting to untangle the complexities of their own life. They might be questioning whether they are on the right path, whether their goals align with their current circumstances, or whether the people around them are supporting or hindering their growth. This kind of self-reflection requires solitude, not as a way to shut others out, but as a way to tune in to their inner voice. Silence allows them to hear what their intuition is telling them, something that can be drowned out by the constant noise of daily interactions. The process of realignment often involves difficult decisions. People may come to realize that they need to let go of certain habits, relationships, or commitments that no longer serve their higher purpose. This realization can be painful, and the fear of disappointing others may weigh heavily on their minds. In their silence, they are not ignoring the people in their lives, but rather grappling with how to navigate these changes in a way that feels authentic to them. They may worry about being misunderstood or judged, which can make them hesitant to communicate openly until they have a clearer sense of what they want and how to express it. For some, this reassessment is about setting boundaries and reclaiming control over their time and energy. They might have spent years prioritizing others' needs above their own, only to realize that they have been neglecting their personal well-being. Their withdrawal is an attempt to create space where they can focus on themselves without external distraction. This can feel abrupt to those around them, but it's a necessary step in learning to value their own needs and establish a healthier balance. In this sense, silence becomes an act of self-care, a way to protect their energy and redirect it toward what truly matters. The act of recalibrating priorities often brings up questions of purpose and fulfillment. People may start to reflect on whether their current actions are leading them toward the life they envision for themselves. They might feel a growing sense of dissatisfaction with routines or relationships that no longer align with their values. In their silence, they are searching for clarity, trying to discern what changes need to be made to create a more meaningful and purposeful life. This period of reflection is not about avoiding others, but about confronting their own reality and making choices that will set them on a better path. During this process, they might also become more selective about where they invest their time and energy. They begin to recognize that not every interaction or commitment deserves their attention, especially if it doesn't contribute to their growth or happiness. This realization can lead them to withdraw from certain connections, not out of malice or disinterest, but because they are prioritizing depth and quality over quantity. They may feel the need to focus on fewer, more meaningful relationships while letting go of those that feel superficial or draining. This shift is not a reflection of the value they place on others, but a sign of their desire to live more intentionally. Sometimes, their silence is also a way to recharge and regain their emotional strength. Life's demands can leave people feeling depleted, and maintaining constant communication can become exhausting, even in the best of circumstances. They might need time to process their emotions, rest, and rebuild their energy before they feel ready to engage fully again. This period of withdrawal is not about pushing others away, but about ensuring they have the capacity to show up as their best selves when they do reconnect. Their silence is a sign of self-awareness, a recognition of the importance of taking care of their own needs before they can be fully present for others. This inward focus can also be a time of growth and transformation. As they reassess their priorities, they may discover new passions, interests, or goals that reshape their perspective on life. They might emerge from their silence with a clearer sense of purpose and a renewed commitment to the things that truly matter. This process can be deeply personal, and they may need time to integrate these changes before sharing them with others. Their withdrawal is not about excluding others, but about doing the inner work necessary to build a stronger foundation for their future. When someone stops contacting you, it can often be an unconscious act of self-protection. People naturally respond to their emotions in ways that shield them from discomfort or uncertainty, even if they're not entirely aware of what's driving their behavior. This self-protection isn't about rejecting you or diminishing the relationship, but rather about managing their internal world. Genuinely love. Emotions can be overwhelming, and when a person feels unsure, vulnerable, or conflicted, retreating into silence might feel like the safest option for them to regain their emotional balance. At the core of self-protection lies the need to feel secure and in control. Life has a way of throwing challenges and unexpected situations our way, and not everyone knows how to navigate these with ease. Some people are not comfortable expressing their feelings openly, especially if they're dealing with emotions they don't fully understand. When faced with confusion or inner turmoil, they might choose silence as a means of avoiding potential conflict or emotional exposure. They withdraw to avoid saying something they might later regret, or to prevent themselves from being seen in a vulnerable state. Silence for them becomes a shield, a way to avoid confrontation with emotions that feel too big or complex to handle. Fear also plays a significant role in this withdrawal. The fear of being misunderstood, judged, or rejected can push someone into silence. They might worry that sharing their true feelings or thoughts could damage the relationship, leading to consequences they're not ready to face. So instead, they retreat, believing that saying nothing is safer than risking a conversation that might lead to hurt or misunderstanding. This self-protective instinct is not about creating distance intentionally, but rather about avoiding perceived harm. Their silence is a reflection of their own fears, not a commentary on your worth or the value of the connection. For many people, silence provides a much-needed escape from the pressure to perform emotionally. Relationships often come with unspoken expectations about how one should act, respond, or communicate. These expectations can feel overwhelming, especially for someone who's already dealing with internal struggles. In moments like these, silence becomes a form of rebellion against those pressures, a way to step back and reclaim a sense of autonomy. They retreat to create space for themselves, to breathe and process without the weight of others' expectations bearing down on them. This isn't about dismissing the relationship, but about finding relief from the demands they feel unable to meet at the moment. Self-protection through silence can also stem from a desire to avoid escalating situations. If they anticipate tension or conflict in the interaction, they might choose to step back instead of engaging. Silence, in this context, is a way to de-escalate potential friction. They might think that by not responding, they're maintaining peace or avoiding an argument. Well, this can feel like avoidance from an outside perspective. It's important to understand that for them, it might be an act of caution and care. They're not trying to hurt you, but are trying to manage their own emotional limits in a way that feels safe. Additionally, their silence could signal a need for emotional recovery. Life's challenges can take a toll on anyone's emotional well-being, and some people might need more time than others to bounce back. When overwhelmed by stress, anxiety, or sadness, communication can feel like an impossible task. They might not have the energy to articulate their thoughts or feelings, so they retreat into silence to give themselves time to recover. In this sense, their withdrawal is an act of self-care, a way to protect their emotional reserves so they can rebuild and eventually re-engage from a stronger place. For others, silence can be a way to create boundaries they've struggled to establish verbally. If they felt overwhelmed by the dynamics of a relationship, whether due to unmet expectations, misunderstandings, or feelings of imbalance, they might choose silence as a way to draw a line. This isn't about punishing or rejecting the other person, but about asserting their need for space and clarity. They may not know how to communicate their boundaries directly, so they express them through withdrawal. This silent boundary setting is their way of taking control of their emotional environment and protecting themselves from feeling overextended or taken for granted. It's also worth noting that silence can be a form of processing. When someone is faced with difficult decisions or emotional realizations, they might need time to think and reflect without external input. In these moments, silence is less about avoiding others and more about creating a space for their own thoughts. They may be trying to make sense of what they're feeling, what they want, or what they need to do next. Their withdrawal is not about shutting you out, but about finding clarity within themselves. Silence allows them to sort through their emotions and ideas at their own pace, free from the pressure to explain themselves prematurely. In some cases, silence is a subconscious attempt to reset or recalibrate the dynamic of a relationship. If they feel the connection has become too intense, one-sided, or overwhelming, they might step back to reassess its balance. They're not necessarily looking to end the relationship, but to find a way to make it healthier and more sustainable. Their withdrawal is an effort to regain perspective and determine what changes might be needed to make the relationship work better for both parties. This recalibration process takes time and often requires solitude to navigate effectively. Silence can also serve as a defense mechanism against feelings of inadequacy or insecurity. If someone feels they're not meeting your expectations or that they're falling short in the relationship, they might withdraw to avoid facing these feelings head on. Their silence is not about a lack of care, but about their own struggle with self-worth. They might worry that their efforts aren't enough, or that they're not capable of providing what you need. And this fear drives them into retreat. Their withdrawal is a reflection of their own inner battles, not an indication of how much they value you or the relationship. Lastly, their silence might simply be a way to preserve their emotional energy. Life can be draining, and some people have limited capacity for emotional engagement, especially during challenging times. By stepping back, they're conserving their energy for what they feel they can handle, ensuring they don't deplete themselves further. Their silence is an act of self-preservation, not a sign of disinterest or disregard. It's their way of coping with the demands of life and protecting their well-being so they can return to the connection when they're ready.